The Russian Revolution is a mystery to most people from the West and even people who lived through its aftermath from the East. You will find that talking to Russians about the Soviet Union is pretty difficult because of the rapes, starvation, slavery, and intense brainwashing that the Russians went through after almost 30 years of war. It's the exact same thing when trying to talk to Germans about Nazi Germany. It's almost impossible for very similar reasons. The brutality and torture that both the Germans and Russians experienced, followed by the re-education processes, it will make perfect sense to you why it's such a difficult topic and why they are so surprised and confrontational when they hear someone arguing the opposite of what they learned in school. Germans actually had to go through an intense denazification process after they were tortured, raped, and starved, and the Russians went through something similar. They were also told how evil they treated the Jews, and they were made to feel guilty as anti-Semitism became illegal after the Jews had destroyed and conquered their countries. Now Aristotle said, "Give me the child until he is 7 and I will show you the man." This is what we're dealing with, a century of Jewish communist brainwashing. Now, you might meet 1 out of 10 Russians who will say life was great under the Soviet Union, but that's comparing it to Eastern Europe today, which is a mess. It's not comparing it to life under the Tsar. Through this series, I'm going to show you how the Russians under the Tsar were becoming one of the most prosperous people as Russia stood to become the new world power, having the largest gold supply in the world and a gold-backed currency with high-paying salaries for the average Russian. The Tsar's rapidly expanding railroad projects into Asia threatened to weaken England's naval trade, and if the revolution never happened, the Allied Entente would have been forced to give Russia Constantinople and the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, as promised in the Constantinople Agreement, which would have made Christian Russia unbelievably powerful. Now, through deconstructing the Russian Revolution, we can begin to make more sense of both World War I and World War II, which will help us understand our world today. I feel that it's up to us in the Western world to re-examine history and give a voice to those in Europe, as it seems like North America and Western Europe will soon experience everything that Eastern Europe and Germany experienced, but with a Muslim Asian twist. That is, unless the European nations can wake up soon and return to their ancestral foundations. Now, the Russian Revolution is a misleading title, because it was really about destroying Russia and replacing its leadership with non-Russians. When we examine who led the revolution, who financed the revolution, and who was responsible for orchestrating the public into fighting the revolution, we see that almost 85% of the leaders were Jewish, as well as the financiers all came from Jewish families. Now let's be clear, when I say Jews, I don't mean all Jews. There is no grand conspiracy that all Jews are part of. I would say it's a very small percentage of Jews. We don't meet in synagogue to discuss how we're going to take over the world. We really just get together on Saturdays, drink some scotch, and argue about politics and who needs help in the community. And let's be honest, the Jews ruling the world don't work alone. They work very closely with a small percentage of non-Jews who are generally part of some kind of secret society based on Jewish mysticism like Freemasonry. Jews might be at the head, but the non-Jews are just as guilty, if not more guilty, because they are betraying their own people for material goods. This is why Hitler banned both Judaism and Freemasonry from Germany. Even the Americans banned Freemasonry and had a political party called the Anti-Masonic Party. One of the first Masonic lodges founded in the United States was founded by Moses Michael Hayes, so it's no secret that the Jews are behind Freemasonry. But the truth is, these psychopath Jews would have zero power if they didn't have their non-Jewish arm, the traitors in our society. But you shouldn't hate all Jews. The Jews in Israel do work hard, they are forced to serve in the military, as most of them do live in debt. They are extremely brainwashed as well, just like most non-Jews. So life isn't easy in Israel. I'm not defending the state of Israel. I'm saying life in Israel for the average Jew isn't easy. Sure, it's much easier when compared to the Palestinians, but the Jews at the top enslave the Jews at the bottom like everyone else. And as we go through Russian Jewish history, you're going to see how the Jewish rabbis and leaders enslaved normal Jews who tried to assimilate into secular culture. The rabbis even had some Jews killed for leaving the community. It's not easy for normal Jews either. So just like in Roman times and Greek times, the Jews have different political parties and different religious views. So don't think that all Jews are united. In fact, the reason the Jews lost the war against the Romans at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD was because they all turned on each other. There was a three-way civil war inside Jerusalem as the Romans were banging at the gate. So the Jews are not as united as you think. The Holocaust really is the new religion of the Jews, and that's what unites them. So to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Jewish Revolution in Russia, we're going to look at key moments in history leading up to the revolution and examine all the people our history books love to leave out. So in this series, we're going to cover a brief history of how the Jews came into Russia and focus on the last 300 years of Russian Jewish history. Part 1 will cover the origin of the Jews in Russia, and we'll stop at Ivan the Terrible. We'll continue in Part 2 with the Romanov dynasty and the Jewish Masonic Revolution, known as the Decembrist Revolution, that mirrored the French Revolution. So let's follow the timeline of the Jews in Russia. Now, because the Russian Revolution is directly linked with Jews returning to Palestine after almost 2,000 years since their exile, we have to look at the Balfour Declaration, which was signed November 2nd, 1917. The October Revolution would start 5 days later on November 7th, or October 25th, according to the old Russian Orthodox calendar, hence why it's called the October Revolution. This is important because the Jewish Rothschilds were known for hating the Tsar and the Christian Russians, as they had been funding all the wars against them previous to the revolution. Now, I hate having to talk about the Rothschild banking family so much, but they were and still are the most powerful bankers in the world, and they stood to lose a lot of power if the Tsar wasn't destroyed. So we're going to begin with a very basic crash course on the Jewish exile from Palestine or Judea between 70 AD and 135 AD, and look at how they ended up in Russia. So we're going to begin by showing that the Jews lost their homeland and temple by massacring Christians, revolting against their empire, corrupt banking practices, and corrupting religion, only to take back their country almost 2,000 years later with the hopes of rebuilding their temple by massacring Christians, revolting against their empire, corrupt banking practices, and corrupting religion. So it's very important to make this connection and show you that this is in fact a 2,000-year-old rivalry between Jews and Christians. World War II, for instance, was really Christian Europe fighting Jewish Bolshevism. No matter what your high school teacher tries to tell you, this is what it was about. It was Talmudic Jews and bankers controlling the Western world who had built an army of forcefully converted atheists in Russia. The Jews wanted to take control over Germany, who had just removed all the Jews from power. This is why the Germans used an Aryan grammatic cross, or a swastika, as their flag, and had the words "God with us" written on their belt buckles, as they reopened all the Christian churches that the Jewish Soviets had shut down. Now, the Jews in Judea back in 70 AD also revolted over cultural changes. It's a lot like today. You have the ultra-religious groups who are opposed to westernization, while a lot of the Jews in Israel are very Western and don't agree with the religious Jews. This was the case 2,000 years ago when there was a clash of Hellenized, Romanized Jews, so Western Jews, versus the more religious Eastern Jews. This can be viewed as the Sadducees versus the Pharisees. These were like two political factions, two political groups. The Sadducees only believed in ruling the nation according to the Torah, the first 5 books in the Bible, Genesis to Deuteronomy, the 5 books of Moses. While the Pharisees taught the oral law, which today we call the Talmud or the Talmud. The Talmud is really rabbis interpreting to you what they think the Bible says. And there's some pretty disturbing stuff in the Talmud. So the Sadducees were kind of like an agnostic atheist group. They didn't believe in an afterlife, and they really only cared about traditions and culture, but they welcomed Roman technology and Roman culture at the same time. And this is majority of the Jews today. They don't really care about the God of the Bible or religion or the afterlife. They are culturally and racially Jewish. They consider themselves secular Jews, not religious. They're more agnostic or spiritual. So we can look at Zionism as the transformation of Jews from religion back to race. The Jews survived without a homeland because they were also a religion. Now, my agnostic Israeli friends will often laugh at me for believing in the Bible. Even my rabbi laughed at me for believing in Moses, while these people use the Bible that they don't believe in as the reason as to why the Jews own Palestine and have a right to be there. Think about that. So the last time the Jews ruled in Palestine was in 70 AD. The Jews launched 3 major rebellions, one in 66 AD, another in 115 AD, where they massacred entire villages of Roman Greeks who were converting to Christianity, causing the deaths of about 500,000 men, women, and children. And their final rebellion was in 132 AD. So after God had blessed his chosen people with 3 crushing defeats, they had to flee to Babylon, or modern-day Iraq, where they finished compiling their new Talmudic religion known as Judaism. So please understand that the Bible is not written by Jews, nor is it fully about Jews. The Old Testament is about people called Israelites. The Jews are just one tribe of the Israelites. But thanks to our corrupt churches today, the Jews have managed to convince the world that the Old Testament is completely about Jews. The Jews founded the Talmud, and it shouldn't be mixed with the Old Testament. So Talmudic Judaism begins to make its push into Europe through North Africa. These Jews are known as Sephardic Jews or Spanish Jews. The Jews who stayed in the Middle East and parts of North Africa, they're known as Mizrahi Jews. But the Jews who settled in Europe are known as Ashkenazi Jews, and this is the group we're going to focus on. Now, we do have some Roman records that the Jews have been in Europe since before the Romans conquered the Greek world. We have some Jewish records, and the Bible agrees with it as well. We also have records of them being expelled from Rome in 139 BC. But this big push into Russia happened when a group of Khazars, Turkish nomads, took Judaism as their religion. So there is a Jewish-Khazar mixing. The Khazar tribes were being pressured to take either Islam or Christianity as their religion, but some of them settled for Judaism. Now some people call them fake Jews, but I just consider them a mix. These Jews have preserved the culture, language, and traditions of the Pharisees so well, and they have managed to take back Jerusalem after all this time. I don't believe fake Jews would care this much. These are crimes of passion, revenge. This is actually unbelievable when you stop and think about what these Jews have accomplished. They have not only survived and preserved their culture, language, and traditions, but they have managed to enslave the world through the shadows, almost completely undetected. So I refuse to give the credit to Turkish nomads who have no connection to Judaism or Jerusalem. I consider what's happening today very biblical, as the Jews are forcing the world to look back to Jerusalem. So you better read the Bible and the Quran and maybe study the Talmud if you want to know what you're talking about. You can't begin to understand the conflict in the world today unless we talk about the 2 things we were told never to talk about at the dinner table, and that's politics and religion. Now, the Russian elite, like the English and the French, come from northern Germanic people, the Vikings from Scandinavia. Saint Vladimir the Great would be known as the man who turned Russia Christian. So 2 points I want to make. Number 1, the Jewish-Christian conflict started before the Jews lost their land and temple. Number 2, as Russia was becoming Christian, we have these Turkish Khazars mixing with the Jews and adopting Judaism. And this is where the Russian-Jewish conflict begins. Now, In the late 10th century, when Vladimir the Great, the ruler of Russia, was choosing a religion for the Russian people, he found that Islam was too restricting, as it forced circumcision and forbade alcohol and eating pork. However, the Jews presented Judaism to them as well, and this is what was said. After having listened to the Jews, Vladimir asked, "Where is their fatherland?" "In Jerusalem," said the preachers. "But the Lord in his anger dissipated us in foreign lands." "And you, who are punished by God, dare to teach others?" said Vladimir. "We do not want to lose our fatherland like you have." You have to appreciate the point Vladimir is making. If you were to look at this spiritually and through the eyes of religion, the Jews obviously did something very wrong that pissed off their God and caused them to be homeless. Ironically, this all happened after they murdered Jesus and his disciples and after they revolted against Rome. So Christianity was the most convenient religion for the Russians, which brings us to Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century. Now, Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Fearless, depending which way you want to look at him, was the Tsar of Russia from 1547 to 1584, and he did not tolerate the Jews at all. He was known as the anti-Jew. Here's an example. When Ivan conquered the city of Polotsk, he forced the Jews to convert to Christianity or die. Those who refused were either drowned in ice water or burned at the stake. This included children. He killed about 300 Jews on that day. Jewish sources say the number was closer to 3,000 dead, but the Jews have a habit of over-exaggerating their numbers. So Ivan was ruthless to the Jews, and I want to point out that all of this is not very Christian. He may think he's doing the right thing, but the Bible doesn't teach this, and forcing people to convert to a religion is never a good idea, especially when it comes to Jews. Jews are very clever. A good example is in the 1400s and the early 1500s in Spain. The Spanish had a serious problem with Jews, very similar to the Russians. In March 1492, there was an edict of expulsion against the Jews, forcing them out of Spain. They also had the Spanish Inquisition, where the first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, was a crypto-Jew, torturing and killing Christians in the name of Jesus for various religious views. His uncle was a cardinal in Rome, and about the same time, in August 1492, we had the rise of Pope Alexander VI, the famous Borgia. He was what they called a Marrano, a crypto-Jew from Spain, according to his rival, Cardinal de la Rova, later Pope Julius II. The Borgias allowed many of the expelled Jews from Spain to settle in Rome, the heart of Christianity, and the Vatican would become completely corrupted, hypersexualized, and anti-Christian. At the same time, the Medici banking family, who were engaging in usury and enslaving the people with debt, had an extremely close relationship with the Jews of Europe. Now, back then, the rule was Christians couldn't lend money with interest, but Jews could. So if you didn't have a leader or a king restricting the Jews from practicing this, the Jews had a serious advantage over Christians, and Jews loved bribing leaders to allow them to practice their religion. The law in the Old Testament hints that you can lend interest to strangers or foreigners and not your brothers. This is written by Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, but this is something Jesus completely forbids. So it was stuff like this that caused the rise of Martin Luther and divided the church, causing the rise of the Protestant Reformation to fight the Catholic corruption that peaked as the Jews were becoming Christians. So there's a lot of reasons why the Tsar didn't like Jews. They just seemed to bring division, debt, and chaos everywhere they went. In fact, Ivan hated the Jews so much that he refused to let Jewish traders even enter his country. Poland was a country dominated by Jews, and there was a time when Ivan the Fearless had a group of Polish Jewish traders arrested and their goods seized. And this is what was said between the King of Poland and Ivan the Fearless. "You do not let our Jewish tradesmen with their goods into your country. Some were arrested and their goods were seized at your orders. However, our peace agreements state that our tradesmen can come with goods into your country, and you can come into my country, and we follow these agreements." Ivan responded, "We have written to you many times about this, letting you know about the awful things the Jews do in my country, making people abandon Christianity, bringing poisonous potions to our land, causing a lot of trouble to our people. We cannot allow the Jews to come into our country, for we do not want to see any trouble here. On the contrary, we want God to let my people in my country to live in peace without any trouble. And you, our brother, must never again write to us about the Jews." So while Ivan is known as the Terrible, he had good intentions. He understood the dangerous mentality of the Jews, who aren't loyal to their host nation and its people, as they are known for undermining the very people who were nice enough to give them a chance to live amongst them in peace. It really is amazing how we've all been conditioned by the Jewish media to hate the Christian system that made us the most prosperous nations in history, and by rejecting our ancestral foundations, we have replaced it with a Jewish system of usury, debt, and slavery. So make no mistake, we are slaves to bankers. Now, it doesn't matter if you believe in God or that Jesus walked on water or not. What's important is that you believe in the morals and the values taught by Jesus, which the Jews despise. This is what Jesus said, "If I do not the works of my Father, believe me not. But if I do, though you believe not me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him." Jesus rose up against the Jewish bankers. He taught children to respect their parents and the elderly. Jesus said to husbands, "Love your wives and give your lives for them. Wives, honor your husbands. Parents, raise your children. Help those less fortunate than you. Love your neighbors as you would yourself. Show mercy to your enemies, because some of your strongest friendships will come from people you once considered your enemies. And the greatest thing a man can do is sacrifice his life to save a friend." This is the example that Jesus set as he destroyed the Jewish system. This was the system Ivan the Terrible was trying to protect from the Jews. Again, you don't have to believe in Jesus, but I challenge any of you to deny his principles and show me a system that has achieved more for mankind than European Christianity. Christianity does not teach us to be a doormat and let people walk all over us. The New Testament does not teach us to be weak. It's the opposite. Jesus does not teach us to forgive child rapists and murderers, and the Apostle Paul makes it clear. "For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die." So just because Jesus saved a woman from being stoned to death for cheating on her husband, it doesn't mean we have to forgive grown men when they commit serious crimes. Paul has no problem being put to death if he is guilty of something worthy of it. Politicians committing treason against its people, murderers, serial rapists, and so forth, they should not be welcome in Western societies. So please don't think that the Bible teaches that we should be forgiving child-raping pedophiles like our Jewish-dominated court system does. Look at what Jesus said he would do to someone who offended a Christian child, and you tell me if Jesus wouldn't have a child rapist killed. "And whoso shall receive one such little child in my name receiveth me. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea." So we left off with Ivan the Terrible, who was known as the anti-Jew. And this pretty much marks the end of Ivan's dynasty, which was one of the oldest ruling dynasties in European history, the Rurik dynasty. The chain of events that follow are extremely interesting. You'll see that you don't need Game of Thrones when you could just read history. So we're going to cover the end of the Rurik dynasty and the times of trouble, or the dark times of Russia, which almost ended the Russian kingdom, and it paves the way for the Romanov dynasty, and we'll look at the role the Jews played in all this. We're going to examine some of the pogroms against the Jews, where various Slavic people rose up against the Jews and their own nobles. We're going to look at a report written by a very well-respected Russian politician where he separates the problem into three main groups: the people, the nobles, and the Jews. So as we go through the Romanovs, we're going to move closer to the Masonic Revolution, known as the Decembrist Revolution, that could have dethroned the Romanovs almost 100 years before the Jewish Bolsheviks. Now, before we get into it, I want to explain something. When I say Jews, I don't mean all Jews. I have a lot of friends that are Jews from the Soviet Union, and we're learning this version of history for the first time together. We all eat bacon, we weren't raised with Judaism. I did go back to the Jewish community when I was in my 20s to relearn Judaism from rabbis, and I ended up becoming a Christian. But for the most part, we grew up like normal secular Europeans and North Americans. We just happened to have Jewish parents, and we were brainwashed with the same version of history as you because we were in the same schools as you. However, this doesn't excuse the Jews. Did the Germans alive today have anything to do with the Nazis or the Holocaust? Of course not. However, the Jews received billions and billions of dollars from Germany, and the Germans today are still forced to pay the Jews and are still blamed for the things that apparently happened before they were born. Why is it okay to blame Germans as a group and enslave their children to pay billions of euros, but it's not okay for you to blame the Jews as a group and force their children to pay for what their ancestors did? So even though I say don't blame all Jews, it doesn't excuse Jews. Judaism is both a religion and a race, so it's confusing. Even as a child, when people asked me what my background was, I would say I was French, Canadian, and Jewish, and 9 out of 10 times I would get the same response. Judaism is a religion. How can you be half a religion? As a child, I couldn't answer this question. I just knew I was half Jewish. So Judaism is a religion, but in the religion they have laws that make it racial, so it is both. So let's lay a foundation for Russian Jewish history. Now, Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Fearsome, was by no means a saint. He was just smart when it came to not letting Jews into his kingdom. There is no such thing as a perfect monarch. But Ivan had experience with the Jews who had almost taken over Russia during the time of his father and grandfather, which we'll cover. So we're going to look at 3 of Ivan's sons, Ivan Ivanovich, Fyodor, and Dmitri. Now, Ivan killed his son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, when they were having a dispute over the Tsar's military failures. He struck his son over the head with his scepter. His advisor and bodyguard, Boris Godunov, was present and tried to save the prince, and even took some of the scepter blows, but Ivan Ivanovich died anyways. Ivan apparently desperately regretted killing his heir, leaving Ivan's son Fyodor as the new crown prince. Now, both these princes were the sons of Ivan and Anastasia Romanovna. Now, I just want to explain something in case some people don't understand how Russian and Eastern European names work. When you look at Russian names like Ivan Ivanovich, you'll notice that they use a patronymic system. So Ivan is his name, but he is the son of Ivan the Terrible, so he is of Ivan, hence Ivanovich. Fyodor, his brother, would be Fyodor Ivanovich. Women would also have a feminized version. So when we look at the name of Ivan's wife, Anastasia Romanovna, we see that the name Romanov actually comes from her father, Roman. Her brother Nikita spells his name differently. It's Nikita Romanovich. And this is where we get the name Romanov. So this system was similar to the ancient Israelites, and even Jews today still use it. Like you would say Joseph ben Israel, which is Joseph, son of Israel. Now, Boris Godunov was married to Maria Grigorievna, the daughter of one of Ivan's trusted friends. So after Ivan died, his son Fyodor became Tsar, but he was extremely mentally and physically weak, and was married to the sister of Boris Godunov. Fyodor died before leaving an heir, and you'll notice that a lot of monarchs become very weak and unhealthy and die very young. While they eat the best foods, they have the best clothes, access to medicine, and live in castles with servants. Now my theory is, instead of poisoning the king, the servants and nobles would slowly poison them over time, not to arouse suspicion. Now I'm just speculating, I have no proof of this. You'll just see that many Russian tsars become very weak and die young, and die slowly over time, like Ivan's son Fyodor. Now, after Fyodor died without an heir, Boris Godunov seized power, and this begins the shortly lived Godunov dynasty. So Boris then has Ivan's son Dmitri murdered, or so at least the evidence points at him. The historians say that Dmitri slit his throat while playing, or that he slit his throat while having an epileptic seizure, and the fact that Boris didn't support Dmitri in becoming Tsar, which would have continued the Rurik dynasty, hints at his guilt. Now, Anastasia Romanovna was the first wife of Ivan the Terrible and Tsaritsa of Russia, so her nephew, Fyodor Romanov, who was the cousin of Ivan's son Tsar Fyodor, posed a threat. So Boris forced Fyodor Romanov to become a monk under the name Filaret, and his wife was forced to become a nun. But their son Michael would eventually become the first Romanov to sit on the Russian throne. Now, after Boris died, we have something super interesting that comes into play. We have a false Dmitri claiming to be the son of Ivan the Terrible that rises up backed by the Kingdom of Poland and Lithuania, who desperately wanted the Russian throne, and we'll see the Jews come into play. So Boris's son and wife were strangled a few months after taking the throne, and they are replaced by this false Dmitri and his Polish noble wife, Marina Mniszek, and they had support from certain corrupt Russian nobles. So we're going to deviate a bit from Russian history and explain a few things about Poland. First, it was the Jewish capital of the world at this time, up until World War II. The Polish were Roman Catholic and the Russians were Russian Orthodox. So there's a Christian division here. The Catholics represent the Western branch of the Roman Empire, while the Orthodox represent the Greek Eastern branch of the Roman Empire. The Jews had gained serious power in the Roman Catholic Church at this time and caused the Protestant Reformation. You'll notice that Martin Luther, the German monk who led the German Protestant Reformation, was extremely anti-Jewish. He even wrote books about it. In part 1, we learned how the Spanish had forced the Jews to convert to Catholicism and expelled the Jews who didn't convert. Well, about this time we have the secret occult organization showing up in the Catholic Church, known as the Society of Jesus, or the Order of the Jesuits. So about 50 years after the Spanish forced the Jews to convert, we have this Jesuit order becoming a serious power in the Catholic Church. They rose up as a military arm to lead the Counter-Reformation. Now the founders were mainly conversos or Marranos, Jews who converted to Christianity. Dr. Robert Merrick talks about this in his book, The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews. It's pretty well documented that these secret societies have strong Jewish connections. You'll notice that a lot of Christians, especially Protestants, blame the Catholic Church for everything, and even call them the whore of Babylon, when it's really Jews that have hijacked the church. You'll notice that as the Catholics were forcing the Jews to convert, you have a Jewish Pope emerge, a Jewish Grand Inquisitor. The Jesuits are established by Jews. We have the rise of Martin Luther, the anti-Jew who led the Protestant Reformation. It was chaos across Europe. This is all happening as the Jews are pretending to become Christians. But the Catholics were fools in thinking that they could force Jews to convert to their ideologies. The Jews could almost use this forced conversion to justify their actions, and this contradicts everything Jesus taught. Now, you also have the Catholics wearing Jewish kippas or yarmulkes when there isn't a single verse in the Bible that tells anybody to wear these ridiculous hats. From my research, to wear this hat is a symbol of your rebellion and rejection of Christ. Now, Catholicism isn't necessarily a Christian religion. You'll notice that most of the holidays that Catholics celebrate are connected to paganism or the old traditions of pre-Christian Europe. Catholics will do Easter instead of Passover. You'll notice that Lent isn't in the Bible. All Saints' Day or Halloween isn't Christian. There is a whole chapter in the Bible telling us not to celebrate Christmas or the winter solstice. And yet what do Christians do? They celebrate the winter solstice. Catholicism is the old European religion painted with Christianity. Right now you'll notice that there is a huge surge of neo-paganism rising, or Odinism, and they blame Christians for stealing paganism, when Christianity really has nothing to do with paganism. It's more pagans who found a way to stay pagan while calling themselves Christians. It was like a political strategy to unite the pagans and Christians under a new Roman religion. The Christian communities were far superior to the pagans, mainly because of Christian morals and values. So it's important not to mix Catholicism or any Christian church with biblical Christianity. And that's not to say that Catholics don't make good Christians. I'm saying the rituals that are performed are not in the Bible. Jesus and Paul battled the same thing in their time when the Jews invented traditions that never existed from the prophets or Moses. Jesus said, "Full well you reject the commandment of God that you may keep your own tradition, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have delivered, and many such like things do you." Paul goes to say, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments of the world, and not after Christ." So Jesus was battling corrupt priests who used religion as a tool to enslave the people. The enemies in the New Testament were priests, bankers, the merchant kings, and the royalty. It's important to remember that. If you hate religion, understand so did Jesus. Religion is a tool used to divide the people, and we'll see this in Russia. Now, the Jews had their tentacles in the Catholic Church, and this gave them enormous influence and power. It's interesting that the word Jesuit takes on the French word je suis, which means I am. When Moses asked God what is his name, God replied with je suis, or Yahweh, which is interesting. While every other god has a name like Odin, this God doesn't have one, because who could name God? So the name I am is very interesting. Now the Jesuit headquarters is in Andorra, which is its own independent city that borders France and Spain. And the Vatican, the City of London, and Washington, D.C. are also their own city-states, like their own countries. It is said that the Vatican controls the world religions, Washington, D.C. controls the world's military, the City of London, the square mile within London, controls the world's finances because the banks are all located in this independent city. But the Black Pope rules from Andorra. Now, we also have a counter-argument because there was a Jesuit priest in Poland at the same time named Peter Skarga, and history records him as a Jesuit anti-Semite who accused the Jews of kidnapping Christian children for ritualistic murder, which became known as blood libeling. So while the Jews played a key role in the Jesuit order, we have the Jesuits leading trials causing pogroms and revolts, so it's confusing. But Jews are known for going to war amongst themselves, which we'll see throughout Russian history, and they are known for controlling their opposition. For example, the Jewish Hasidic movement, which is one of the dominating Jewish factions today, was born out of Jews rebelling against the rabbis of their time. So now that we have a better understanding of what's happening in Europe at this time, we can better understand what's happening in Russia. So we have Catholic Poland with Europe's largest Jewish community who had just launched a rebellion in Russia. They strangled the wife and son of Boris Godunov and placed a Polish Catholic as Tsaritsa and a false Dmitry on the throne, who was the supposed son of Ivan the Terrible. Now, this didn't last for more than a year before some Russian nobles rebelled against them and placed a man named Vasily as Tsar. Now, this Vasily was a Russian noble descended from the Rurik dynasty. I would call him the Littlefinger of Russia. Littlefinger is from Game of Thrones and is famous for betraying everyone for his own personal gain, as he advances himself by climbing the ladder of chaos. Vasily was the man who gave the testimony that the real Dmitry Ivanovich was dead and stabbed himself in the throat while having a seizure. So Vasily helped Boris Godunov seize power. He then retracted his testimony after Boris died, saying the real Dmitry was still alive, causing the murder of Boris's son and wife, placing the Polish-backed false Dmitry on the throne. He then betrayed false Dmitry and said the real Dmitry did die, placing himself on the throne. But the wife of false Dmitry, Marina, returned to Poland. Now, the Polish then used Russian nobles known as the Seven Boyars to overthrow Vasily. They forced him to become a monk, and he died in Poland a few years later. The boyars tried to put Vladislav, the Prince of Poland, on the throne as Tsar, but there were problems. Poland wanted Russia to become Catholic, and the nobles wanted Vladislav to convert to Orthodoxy. Now, the King of Poland never let his son go to Russia and sit on the Russian throne, in fear that the nobles would kill him or use him as a hostage, since Russia and Poland were at war. So Vladislav held the title of Tsar for less than 3 years, but never sat on the throne. So Polish and Swedish armies began taking Russian land, forcing the boyars or nobles to elect a new Tsar or else be conquered. So they convened a national assembly known as the Zemski Zabor, where about 1,000 nobles, priests, and leading merchants came to elect a new Tsar. And so Michael Romanov was elected. So after Michael was made Tsar, he faced 3 rival claimants to the throne. To the north he faced Sweden, to the west he faced Poland, and to the south he faced Marina Mniszek, the former Polish Tsaritsa, who had rallied an army of Poles, Muscovites, and Cossacks to her side. So Marina was still trying to take back the Russian throne. She claimed that the first false Dmitri never died, so this new Dmitri became known as False Dmitri II. Now, according to both Jewish and non-Jewish sources, False Dmitri II was Jewish. He was apparently known for reading the Talmud or other Jewish books, while some sources say he was the son of a priest. Now, False Dmitri II was murdered in 1610 while riding his horse drunk while invading Russia, but Marina was pregnant at the time and gave birth to a son named Ivan Dmitrievich, who later became known as Ivan the Little Thief, the supposed grandson of Ivan the Terrible. She also remarried a Cossack leader named Ivan Zarutsky and tried to use the Cossacks to rebel against Michael. Now, after Michael was crowned Tsar, the Cossacks decided they didn't want to help Marina and her pretender son Ivan take the throne. Russia had been devastated by the times of trouble. They say that production in Russia was down to only 10% of what it was before. So the Cossacks handed over Zarutsky, Marina, and her son Ivan. Zarutsky was impaled on a stake, and Ivan was hanged as a thief, while Marina died in prison the following year. So Michael's father was now an Orthodox bishop under the name Filaret, but was being held prisoner by the Poles, and had no knowledge that his son was made Tsar. Now, Michael then made peace with Poland and Sweden, accepting losses of Russian land and freeing all the Russian prisoners. So this marks the end of the time of trouble, or the dark times of Russia. Michael Romanov was now Tsar, and his father Fyodor Romanov, or Bishop Filaret, was made Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. The Patriarch is kind of like the Pope of the Orthodox Church. And together, father and son ruled over Russia, both church and state, and brought peace and prosperity to the land. Michael would rule from 1613 to 1645, and then pass the throne to his son Alexei. Now I want to point out a few things that happened under the rule of Alexei. The first is, Patriarch Nikon had to write a letter to the Tsar, stating that the Jews who had converted to Christianity still practice their Jewish faith and are demoralizing the Christian monks. So, similar to the Catholic Church, the Jews were converting to Orthodoxy and causing problems from within the Russian Church, while keeping their Jewish faith. The Jews even quote this in the Jewish Encyclopedia. Now, this shouldn't surprise us. During the reign of the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible, Ivan III, the Jews had managed to corrupt many of the Orthodox priests, and managed to raise them to some of the highest positions in the Orthodox Church. The priests were part of a secret movement that crept inside the church and started replacing Christianity with Kabbalistic Jewish mysticism. This event became known as the heresy of the Judaizers. Now, the Bible warns us that men will do this in the book of Jude, where it warns us to keep the original teachings of Jesus and the early followers, and that corrupt men will creep inside the church and pervert Christianity from within. So the Jews brought in all kinds of heresies, like astrology, magic, witchcraft, while reducing Christ to nothing, saying that the real Messiah still hasn't come. The Kabbalah became a key instrument in corrupting the Christian Russians, very similar to today. The Jews in Hollywood have built an army of celebrity Kabbalists who openly practice Jewish mysticism. Madonna has been used for the last 40 years to brainwash young girls. She's apparently a Kabbalah high priestess. So when you see celebrities wearing these red scarlet bracelets, understand that it links them to mystic Judaism. This scarlet thread is used early in the Bible. What happened was Judah, who is the father of the Jews and not to be mistaken for Israel, and this is important for us to understand, that Judah and the Jews will become the enemies of Israel later in the Bible. Judah was also the villain in the book of Genesis. Judah hired a prostitute, not knowing it was Tamar, his daughter-in-law, and ended up getting her pregnant. He later discovered that Tamar was pregnant and demanded that she be put to death for cheating on his son, who she was supposed to eventually marry. But Judah realized that he was actually responsible and stopped her execution. Now when Tamar was giving birth, they realized she was giving birth to twins, and when the first baby's arm came out of the womb, the nurses tied a scarlet thread around his finger or hand to mark which child is the firstborn. But somehow the baby with the scarlet thread, Zerah, was born second, and his birthright was given to his brother Pérès. So the scarlet thread is associated with the line of Judah through this story, when the patriarch of the Jews impregnated his own daughter-in-law while he was hiring a prostitute. So coming back to our story, the Jews had infiltrated the Catholic Church in the 15th century and had almost taken over the Russian Orthodox Church during the same time period. It was Gennady, the Archbishop of Novgorod, who rose up against the Judaizer sect with the help of Russian theologian Joseph Volotsky. In the end, the leader of the sect, Zachariah ben Aaron HaKohen, the Cohen, was executed and the others were exiled. So it's important to note that the Jews hijacked the Russian Orthodox Church and then used the church as a tool to secularize the Russians, to disconnect them with Jesus. So when the Jews cry about being persecuted, understand that it wasn't for no reason. The Russians didn't wake up one day and just start hating Jews. You'll notice that the Jews ask for it. When we were young and being brainwashed by the public education system, we learned that the evil Nazis woke up one day and started hating the Jews for no reason. We learned that the Nazis were making laws prohibiting Jews from being in the government or owning German banks. The Nazis began boycotting Jewish stores and even began destroying all the Jewish-owned businesses. But we never learned why. When you learn that Jewish bankers had financed World War I and then betrayed the Germans to the British to obtain Palestine, causing millions of German deaths, and then that the Jews had financed and led the Bolshevik Revolution, spreading communism and blowing up Christian churches, and that the Jews had bankrupted Germany and bought up its industry for pennies on the dollar, and how the Jews had turned Berlin into the sex, drug, and suicide capital of Europe, and how it was Jews who declared an international boycott on German products, and how Jews in America were screaming for the destruction of Germany, and how the Germans didn't start destroying Jewish stores until Jew Herschel Greenspan murdered a German diplomat named Ernst von Roth. You see, now it makes sense why the Germans were angry at the Jews. So the Russians had a lot of reasons for attacking the Jews. Now at first, the Jews had no restrictions under Alexei, but after he expelled the Jews from newly acquired Lithuanian and Polish cities. This was right after a Jewish massacre known as the Chmielnicki Uprising. Now, Bogdan Chmielnicki led a Cossack revolt against the Kingdom of Poland, specifically against the Jews and Catholics, nobles and Jews. Now, this is super interesting because Bogdan is considered as an Orthodox and Ukrainian hero, but to Jews and Catholics he is hated. Bogdan was such a good general and hero that he is still displayed on Ukrainian money today, and is also considered one of the greatest anti-Semites in history. Now, there are two options here. Either he was a racist anti-Semite Nazi, or there was a reason why he rebelled against the Jews. Let's come back to this Cossack rebellion in a bit. First, let's go back further in history to Kiev in 1113, exactly 500 years before the Romanovs took power. We have the Kievan Rus rise up in rebellion against the Jews and the nobles of Kiev. Why are the Jews always being attacked? Were the Kievan Rus also Nazi anti-Semites? No, the Jews and the nobles were working together to enslave the people. So in Kiev in 1113, you had the Jews and the nobles who conspired together to build a monopoly on salt and grain, which is a really big deal, especially in winter climate countries. The people needed to salt their meats and vegetables in order to survive. For example, by simply adding some salt to cabbage, you get sauerkraut, which is high in vitamin C. The Roman legions thousands of years ago used to be paid in salt because it was such a valuable commodity. You'll notice that the name Zelcer is common among Eastern European Jews. The word comes from salt and czar. It means czar of salt, Solzar. The Jews were known for their salt monopolies and working with the nobles to enslave the people. And we're dealing with the same thing today. The White House is full of Jews. The president's grandchildren are Jews. Jews own Hollywood. They brag about controlling the banks and the media. And they could only get these positions if they controlled our leaders, which is exactly what happened. Do you notice how we're all fighting over things that don't really matter? And that not a single politician attacks the Jewish banks? So we're going to look at a report done by a Russian politician named Dzerzhavin. Dzerzhavin breaks it down into three groups: the peasants, or the people, the nobles, the people in power, and the Jews. So we're going to jump ahead in history and we'll come back a bit later. Now, this is super important because this will explain why the Jews are so hated. So, Dzerzhavin was sent to Belarus, which was part of Poland, but at this time it was part of Russia. Poland was divided by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, so Russia absorbed a lot of Polish Jews after the collapse of Poland. So there was a serious famine plaguing the region, and Dzerzhavin was sent to investigate, and this is what he said. Pay attention. As I came to Belarus, I personally saw the dwellers had great need for food. The hunger was so acute that almost everyone ate steamed weeds with the tiniest addition of flour or groats. The peasants are thin and pale like dead men. In order to prevent that, I investigated the right landowners and found out who of them had food in their storages. I borrowed it from them and distributed it among the poor. I ordered the seizure of an estate of a certain count who heartlessly charged enormous prices for his supplies. So not only are people suffering, but the landlords are now selling the food that they have stored at high prices. Similar to Hurricane Harvey, where some stores sold cases of water for $99 and a gallon of gasoline was sold for $20. They used people's desperation and misery as a way to make money. So let's continue. As the nobles heard of such strict measures, they became more humane, awakening from a cruel indifference in respect of other human beings, and did their best to feed the peasants by procuring bread from the neighboring gubernias. In 2 months the wheat was harvested and the famine was over. He traveled all over the gubernia. Dzerzhavin induced such fear into the mayors and bailiffs that the nobility started plotting against Dzerzhavin and sent the emperor a slanderous complaint against him. Dzerzhavin discovered that the Jews were using the peasants' alcoholism for their own benefit. Also, having discovered that the Jews, out of their love of gain, made the peasants pay for drink with bread, distill the bread into vodka, and thus create famine, I ordered prohibition on their distilling facilities in the village of Liozno. At the same time, I gathered information from the most prudential dwellers and from noblemen, merchants, and villagers about the lifestyle of the Jews, about their businesses, their lies, and all their tricks and maneuvers that they used to induce into poverty the silly and poor villagers, and about the measures that we could use to protect the naive commoners from the Jews, and to give them opportunities to earn their bread in an honest and decent way, and to transform them into decent citizens. As for the peasants, when they finish harvesting the crops, they are not moderate nor careful in their expenses. They drink, eat, party, and give the Jews everything that the Jews ask for to cover the peasants' old debts and their drinking. That is why when winter comes, the peasants fall into poverty. In each village, the landowners have built pubs, and in some villages there are even several pubs that sell spirits daily and nightly for their profit and for the profit of the Jewish tenants. In those pubs, the Jews lure out not only their daily bread, but the crops still growing in the earth, the farming tools, the property, the time, the health, and the life itself. The situation is worsened by the Kalida tradition, when the Jews travel from village to village, especially during harvest, and get the peasants with their families drunk. As they do it, they collect their debts and take away the last bits of food, cheat the peasants when they pay for their drinks, they rob them clean, and thus drive the villagers to complete poverty. So let's understand the game the Jews are playing. So the landlords are Polish Roman Catholics who are being paid by the Jews to lease the land. The Jews would often pay up to 3 to 4 times what the land was worth. The Jews in turn would retain the rights to distill the alcohol and run the inns and pubs. They wanted monopolies on the alcohol. The peasants, who were Russian Orthodox, would drink themselves into debt. The Jews would even lend them alcohol at interest so the peasants would owe them more money or their next crops, which the Jews just turned into more alcohol, so there was a famine in Belarus. Now, we can't just blame the Jews here, and this presents a really great argument. We have the greedy Catholic landlords who don't care about their land or the Orthodox Christian peasants working the land. We have the irresponsible peasants who can't control their drinking or manage their own lives. And we have the Jews simply making the Christians an offer to betray each other for material gain. Who do we blame? Drzeżowin poses this question. He doesn't just blame the Jews. The Jews are really just playing the role of Satan, offering you a chance to turn your back on your people for temporary material gain. You don't have to take it. And this is our problem today. The Jews are just taking advantage of our own greed and stupidity. We can all say no. Now, the Jews and landlords sent false accusations against Drzeżowin, saying that while he was inspecting one of the farms, he beat a pregnant Jewish woman, causing her to lose her baby. Now, it was impossible for Drzeżowin to do it. He didn't have enough time. He simply walked through that farm and didn't see a pregnant woman. So yes, the Jews will come at you with all kinds of slander, but that's what devil means in Greek, slanderer, not a guy with a pitchfork like priests want you to believe. The devil is someone who falsely slanders you or accuses you. This is what Satan and the devil actually mean. Once you've been falsely accused, you now have to prove your innocence or forever be known as a man who beats on pregnant women. It is said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. Now, I personally blame the Polish Catholics here, like I blame our own politicians and religious leaders. They should have said no to the Jews and protected their Christian brothers, but even Catholic priests were also making money here, not just landlords and Jews. The Jews corrupted everyone. And this is why Bogdan and the Cossacks rose up and began killing Jews in 1648, because the Jews also put taxes on the Orthodox Christians if they wanted to get married, build a church, bury someone, or anything religious. These are Jews who were leasing the land from Catholics, using God and religion as a business. Now, during the time of Drzeżowin, the Orthodox Christians were nice enough to let the Jews live in their empire, and the Polish Catholics to retain their land after Poland collapsed. And this is how the Jews and Catholics thanked them, by enslaving the peasants with debt, turning them into drunks, bribing the priests and landlords, turning God and religion into a business, and monopolizing the alcohol trade, causing a famine. This is why the Cossacks massacred the Jews, so don't think they did it for no reason. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Cossacks were like a nomadic people, or free folk, who mainly occupied southern Russia, eastern Ukraine, and parts of Poland. The Cossacks weren't really loyal to Russia, they were Cossacks, and they could choose which side of any war they wanted to fight for, and they will play a major role throughout Russian history. A great example for the Cossacks is in World War II, where many Cossacks fought for Hitler and the Nazis, trying to retake their country from the Jewish Soviet Union, which debunks the myth that Hitler wanted to exterminate the Slavic people. After the Allies had defeated Germany, the Cossacks agreed to surrender to the British, assuming that the British would sympathize with their anti-communist views. Little did they know that it was Western Jews who financed communism and saved the Jewish Soviet Union when Hitler and the Cossacks had almost liberated Russia. The British betrayed the Cossacks and sent them back to Stalin, where tens of thousands of Cossack men, women, and children faced torture, starvation, rape, and execution. Many of them committed suicide before being repatriated to the Jewish Soviet Union. The Cossacks said, "The NKVD and the Gestapo would have just killed us with bats, but the British killed us with words of honor." If you ever see the movie James Bond GoldenEye, that's actually what this is about. The villain, Alec Trevelyan, or 006, is a survivor and a descendant of the Lienz Cossacks, who were betrayed by the British. The British adopted this Cossack orphan and raised him to be a British spy to serve England. The entire movie is about this Cossack trying to get revenge on the British who betrayed his entire family, while he tries to destroy the Jewish banking system with the help of anti-communist Russians. James Bond, of course, stops this evil Nazi Cossack and saves the Jewish banking system, which is destroying the Western world to this day. And this reminds me of a verse from the Bible. "Woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, that put darkness for light and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." In part 3, we will continue with the sons of Tsar Alexei, Ivan V, and Peter, and their sister Sophia, who tried to seize the throne. We'll continue to follow the Romanovs to the Decembrist Revolution and examine the role of the Jews until the Jewish Bolsheviks will eventually destroy everything Peter and the Romanovs had built. We left off under the times of Tsar Alexei, the son of Michael Romanov. So we're going to go from the times of Tsar Alexei and finish by covering the Decembrist Revolt of 1825, which will take us to the rise of liberalism and help us understand our world today. Now we're going to see a change in the Jewish strategy. Instead of infiltrating Christian organizations, they're going to lure Christians into their occult organizations and use the Christians to bring down their own empires. So we'll also be talking about Jewish Freemasonry. Now, when it comes to the Jews under Tsar Alexei, we learned in part 2 that Patriarch Nikon, the head of the Orthodox Church, was complaining to the Tsar that the Jews converting to Orthodoxy were keeping their Jewish religion while demoralizing the Russian priests. Which we see today, that majority of Christian churches teach stories and myths more based on the Talmud and mystic Judaism than the actual Bible. We learned that the Cossacks had launched a major revolt in 1648 against the Jews and Catholic landlords, known as the Hmelnytsky Uprising, where Bogdan Hmelnytsky, the general of the uprising, became a great Christian Orthodox hero and became one of history's greatest anti-Semites. Now, after this time, we'll notice that the Jewish power in Russia is neutralized for the moment, and we'll notice that even when the Jews were removed from power, it doesn't change human nature. Alexei's Russian tutor, Boris Morozov, took advantage of his position and built a salt monopoly, leading to the Moscow salt riots of 1648, similar to how the Jews built a salt monopoly, which led to the uprising in Kiev in 1113. Morozov was accused of bringing in witchcraft and sorcery, similar to how Ivan the Terrible accused the Jews of doing the same thing. Sorcery and witchcraft can be looked at as the medieval term to explain drugs. So it's important to blame criminals, whether they are Jews or non-Jews. We have to take a certain level of responsibility for ourselves and judge ourselves before we can judge others. And our leaders should learn from history that eventually the people will rise up and bring them all to justice. Now, Alexei was famous for canceling all trade with England. We learned in the video Jewopoly that the Jews had financed the English Civil War in 1642. The English parliamentarians, or redcoats, were under command of Oliver Cromwell, who was funded by the Jews to launch the English Civil War. The Jews had entered England and began plotting a revolution by working with their non-Jewish agents to murder the King of England, Charles I, in 1649. This caused Alexei, Tsar of Russia, to cancel all trade with England. After Cromwell and his redcoats had taken power, they immediately allowed the Jews the right to return and settle back in England. The Bank of England would be created a few decades later. Now, little did Alexei know that his dynasty would meet a similar fate when the Jewish Bolsheviks would launch the communist Red Revolution in 1917. So there is a connection between the Jews and the Red Revolutions. Now, to understand why the Jews are always using the color red, we can find some clues in the Bible. So we learned in part 2 that the Jews are only one tribe of Israel, and that the Jews and the Israelites had two separate kingdoms, and that they were at war with each other. So the Jews are not Israel, but were the enemies of Israel. So in the Bible, we learn that the bloodline of Judah was marked with a scarlet thread. The Bible also tells us that the lion is the symbol for the tribe of Judah. This becomes interesting because lions have nothing to do with England, and it was William the Bastard, or William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who conquered England in 1066, that brought in this color with the lion. What's interesting is that according to the Jewish Encyclopedia and the Doomsday Chronicles, the Jews played a major role in financing William the Bastard by financing his war for the throne, and the Jews first came into England with him as they were then made the tax collectors of England. There is a legend that William's mother was a Jew, hence why they called him the Bastard. So understand that the Norman conquest of England was financed by Jews, and that the Jews became the moneylenders and tax collectors of England after William came to power, which does give an explanation as to why the Lion of Judah and the scarlet flag wave over England to this day. The Jews would be expelled from England in 1290 under King Edward I, only to return in 1655 under Cromwell, who said that the Jews are God's chosen people and have a messianic prophecy to fulfill. It's interesting that both the Rothschild banking dynasty and the British royal family use a similar coat of arms. When looking at the British coat of arms, we see a lion has been given a crown, and that the unicorn is being chained and enslaved by a crown. What makes this interesting is when we use the biblical symbolism, the unicorn is supposed to represent the kingdom of Israel, the true chosen people, according to the Bible, and the lion represents the kingdom of Judah. So Israel is enslaved by the Jews, and Israel doesn't even know they exist. So Tsar Alexei canceled his trade agreement with England, which brings us to Fyodor III Alexievich. Tsar Fyodor was the son of Tsar Alexei and was born through the Miloslavsky line. Tsar Alexei had heirs from two different women, Maria Miloslavsky and Natalia Narushkin, and we're going to see some serious Game of Thrones action between these houses as they rival each other for the throne. Fyodor III is a tragic story because Tsar Fyodor had all the qualities required to be a great ruler, and he potentially could have been the greatest ruler and reformer in all of Russian history. But sadly, the one quality he lacked was good health, which leads me to believe that he might have been poisoned. Tsar Fyodor III only ruled for 5 years, and inherited the throne when he was only 15 years old. Fyodor was a Tsar who took matters into his own hands, and laid several great reforms for the Kingdom of Russia. Tsar Fyodor reformed the military, creating one of Europe's most powerful armies, repelling Turkish armies that outnumbered his 2-to-1. He founded the Russian Academy of Science. He lowered taxes and reformed the system of taxation. He transformed Moscow from a city of wood, which was prone to burning, into a city of stone, which was accomplished through a 10-year interest-free loan period. He personally burned all the noble books containing the noble bloodlines or pedigrees, where the nobles were able to inherit positions and jobs based upon their lineage. From now on in Russia, all the positions would be obtained through hard work and merit, not based upon who you knew and who you were related to. He abolished barbaric punishments such as chopping off hands, feet, and fingers, and instead he would move these criminals to parts of Russia that needed workers, or he would move them to regions that were underpopulated. In order to fight injustice and corruption, he reopened the Court of Petitions, where a person of any rank could file a petition to the Chamber of Justice, or even directly to the Tsar himself. I'm sure some of you know what it's like to be trapped in a job or in a situation where you have an abusive or controlling boss that makes your life miserable. Tsar Fyodor created a system where you could actually go over your boss's head and talk to their boss or government official, which helped prevent people in high positions from abusing their power. Hitler did something similar in Germany during his reign. Tsar Fyodor also secularized the school systems. Now, I consider myself a devout Christian, but I fully support the secular school system. I believe it's important to have a neutral school system that explores all views and possibilities, where children can question, is there a God? If so, which God? Or did mankind evolve from apes, and does matter randomly create itself? Without this conflict and debate, we can never hope to advance. Today, the idea of creationism is totally mocked and rejected, and yet there is not a scientist alive that can tell you how to create a grain of sand from nothing. All throughout our history, we fall into cycles where the churches become corrupt, and then we lose God, and then we find Him again. This is the theme throughout the entire Bible. So Tsar Fyodor III had the potential to become Russia's greatest Tsar, but because of his bad health, his reign would be shortly lived. Tragically, his wife, who he loved more than anything, died 3 days after giving birth, and the son that she bore died 6 days later. Tsar Fyodor remarried, but died 3 months after his wedding. Because Tsar Fyodor died without leaving an heir or instructions to who would inherit after him, this would lead to the Moscow Uprising of 1682, which would lead to the fight for the throne between the two Romanov factions, the Romanov-Narushkins and the Romanov-Miloslavskis. Now, with the death of Fyodor, we had the two Romanov branches contending for the throne. The Miloslavsky branch brought forth Ivan, who was 15 years old, half-blind and partially disabled, while the Narushkin branch brought forth Peter, who was only about 10 years old, but highly intelligent and healthy. The nobles and the church proclaimed Peter the new Tsar of Russia, which pushed the Miloslavskis out of power and the Narushkins into power. So the Miloslavskis would spread rumors and propaganda to gain support of about 20,000 soldiers. This is called the Streltsy Uprising of 1682, or the Moscow Uprising, which brings us to the daughter of Tsar Alexei, Sophia Alexeyevna. Now, Sophia was a very crafty and intelligent princess. Her mother had spread rumors that Fyodor III was poisoned by the Narushkins, while Sophia used the military's corruption in the Streltsy regiment to overthrow the Narushkins. This led to the deaths of over 100 nobles and Narushkin supporters, including some of Peter's uncles and his mentor Artemon Matviev, who was cut into pieces. Peter managed to survive, but witnessed the entire event, which traumatized him for life. In the end, an agreement was made that Peter and his half-brother Ivan would share the throne, and a double throne was created. They had a secret window in the back where Russian advisors could whisper to the kings, telling them what to say when they were passing judgment. But Sophia was placed as regent until Peter came of age. This will lead to one of the most dangerous power struggles in the history of Russia. So, joint power was established between Peter and his mother on one half, who lived in a district called Preobrazhenskoye, and Sophia and Ivan, who lived in the Kremlin. Like most of the males in the Miloslavsky branch, Ivan was sickly, partially blind, and intellectually disabled, which allowed Sophia to rule almost supreme. Sophia placed men loyal to her in key positions, like Vasily Golitsyn. Now, even though Sophia seemed to be ruthless and very cutthroat, Vasily Golitsyn was actually a pretty great man. He urged Sophia to continue to follow in her brother Fyodor's footsteps and to continue the reforms he started. Vasily Golitsyn was actually 150 years ahead of his time. He wrote up reforms that would free the serfs and peasants, establish freedom of religion, and he called for educational and industrial reforms, which the nobles at the time never would have agreed to. Golitsyn was sent to capture Crimea in the Crimean Campaign from 1687 to 1689. The scorched earth tactics used by the Ottomans and the Crimean Khanate destroyed half of the Russian army and weakened Sophia's power in Moscow. Sophia tried desperately to retain power and tried to overthrow Peter more than once. The nobles, priests, and leading citizens would eventually grow tired of Sophia, and eventually all of Russia was on the side of Peter. Peter had Sophia banished to a monastery, but Peter allowed his brother Ivan V to remain joint rulers with him. Ivan V really only took part in ceremonies and had little to do with ruling the kingdom, due to his declining health. Tsar Ivan V died in 1696 at the age of 29, leaving his half-brother Peter to rule. Now, coming to Peter the Great, he was not your typical Tsar. He loved physical labor and was very adventurous. He was a known shoemaker, carpenter, smith, and shipbuilder. Peter would often disguise himself as a commoner and walk among the people. He taught himself German and Dutch by spending time in the foreign district in Moscow, conversing with foreigners. Peter traveled to the Netherlands, where he took a job on the docks as a boat builder. He was not your typical Tsar. While Peter was away in Western Europe, his sister Sophia launched a rebellion to try to take the throne from Peter, but Peter's loyal servants defeated the Streltsy rebel army. When Peter returned from the west, he personally executed some of the rebels, as well as hanged many of the Streltsy over the prison where he put Sophia. So it's worth pointing out that when we take out the Jewish factor, we see that this is human nature. Now, it doesn't mean that the Jews aren't going to come into play, but it's worth mentioning that this battle of temporary material gain and earthly power lives inside each one of us. The question is, how far are you willing to go? Remember, the only thing you're taking with you after you die are your actions and your words. When we are born, we enter this world with nothing, and when we die, we will leave the world the same way. Only our choices will follow us. So be careful what you choose. So the material you acquire will not follow you into the next world, but the things you did to obtain them will. This is why Jesus said, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Now, it's under Peter we'll see the Jews begin to come back into our story. Both the Jewish Encyclopedia and Solzhenitsyn record the words of Andrei Nartov, who was an inventor and scientist under Peter, and quoted Peter in saying, "I would rather accept Muslims and pagans to my country rather than Jews. They are cheats and liars. I am eradicating evil, not spreading it. The Jews will have neither residence nor trade in Russia, even though they try hard to obtain it by bribing my retainers." Peter goes to say, "You imagine that the Jews are so shrewd as to be able to gain advantage over the Christian merchants. But I assure you that my people are more cunning even than the Jews, and will not permit themselves to be deceived." Peter was also strongly influenced by Martin Luther. Now, was Peter anti-Jewish? Not necessarily. One of the advisors of Peter the Great and his friend was a Polish Jew named Peter Shafirov. Shafirov was the head translator in Russia and was promoted to the position of vice-chancellor. The Shafirov family were converts to Christian Orthodoxy. Now, Shafirov would be charged with embezzling from the royal treasury and stripped of all his titles and wealth, but later he was pardoned and restored to his positions. Peter the Great was the first official emperor of Russia and was a great Russian reformer, especially when it came to the Russian navy and army. Peter the Great was famous for his victories over Sweden, both on land and on sea. Now, Sweden had the most advanced and powerful military in Europe at the time, and when Peter the Great defeated them at the Battle of Poltava, the rest of Europe now understood that Russia was a force to be reckoned with. Now, it's worth mentioning that Sweden was vastly outnumbered and outgunned at the Battle of Poltava, and they were engaged in war with Poland before. So even though this is a great victory for Peter the Great, the Swedes were against impossible odds. So Peter had taken back Russian lands from the Swedes, giving Russia access to the Baltic Sea, which they had lost during the times of trouble. After taking back Russian lands from Sweden, Peter would begin constructing a new city for trade and a city worthy of his new Grand Russian Navy. The city of St. Petersburg bears the name of Peter the Great and is currently the fourth largest city in Europe today. After the death of Peter, Peter's wife Catherine would take the throne, and Russia would begin to slowly decline. After the death of Catherine, the throne was given to the grandson of Peter the Great, because his son Alexei was killed for treason by Peter. There was little love between Peter the Great and his son Alexei. Alexei lived in constant fear of his father. Alexei had to flee to his brother-in-law, Charles VI of the Holy Roman Empire, believing that his father Peter the Great wanted him dead. He eventually returned to Russia, only to be charged with treason. He was then tortured and executed. After the death of Peter, the Narushkin and Miloslavskis would continue their fight for the throne, But all of this would change when a German princess named Sophia Frederick Auguste would take the throne of Russia and usher in what history calls the Golden Age of Russia. Princess Sophia would be remembered as the mother of Russia and go down in history as Catherine the Great. Now, it's between the time of Catherine the Great and the Decembrist revolt that we're going to see the Jews and Freemasons emerge from the shadows and begin to slowly undermine the Russian royal families and begin to destroy Christianity from Russia with their liberal reforms. So Princess Sophia would be married to the grandson of Peter the Great, Peter III, through his daughter Anna. Peter III was also the son of Charles Frederick of Sweden, giving him claims to both the Swedish and Russian throne. Now the aunt of Peter III, the daughter of Peter the Great, Elizabeth, would seize the throne from her Miloslavsky cousin Anne and imprison the last Miloslavsky Tsar, Ivan VI. Empress Elizabeth said, "The Jews shall be prohibited from entering and living in our Russian cities, as we know that the said Jews continue to live in our empire, trading and keeping inns and pubs, which does not bear any good fruit for the empire. On the contrary, we should expect extreme trouble from those haters of our Lord and Savior. So we decree to banish all the Jews of all ages and sexes, of all ranks and titles from our empire, from our cities, towns, and villages, and let them go abroad, and never let them enter our empire again, unless they want to take up the holy baptism, in which case they should be baptized in our empire, but not let them leave our state again." When her Senate said that the Jews from Poland and Lithuania should be left to trade in the empire because they would bring in a lot of profit to the country, Her Imperial Majesty wrote back, "I do not want any interest or profit from the enemies of Christ." Peter III was crowned heir of Russia by his aunt and renounced his claim to the Swedish throne. Because Peter III was raised in Sweden, Russian nobles didn't like him, and he apparently spoke very poor Russian. During the reign of Elizabeth, Russia would be plunged into war with Prussia during the 7-Year War. The 7-Year War could be considered a world war. It started when British soldiers ambushed French soldiers in North America and would plunge Europe into a bloody conflict in all parts of the world. Russia would bleed thousands of soldiers in the fight against Prussia. And as Russian soldiers began their final assault on Berlin, Elizabeth would die suddenly. Upon taking the throne, Peter III would order all the Russian soldiers to return to Russia and offered his friend Frederick of Prussia peace without any demands. It didn't seem to matter to him at all that thousands of Russians had died in preventing Prussia from expanding their empire. But to insult the Russian soldiers even more, he forced them to adopt Prussian-style uniforms. Peter III became hated by his soldiers. He also made many enemies in the Russian court. So Princess Sophia, the wife of Peter III, was baptized into the Orthodox Church and took the name Ekaterina, or Catherine. She worked very hard in perfecting her Russian, and was known for waking up early in the mornings to help her servants with chores in order to practice her Russian. According to her diary, her marriage was loveless, but they did produce a son named Paul. Some question if the son was Peter's, but the point was the Romanovs had their heir. It's interesting that the Romanov bloodline becomes more Swedish and German than Russian at this point, but when Paul was born he was taken from Catherine and was raised by Elizabeth. Now, Peter III apparently had passed many reforms that helped Russia and made him very popular among the people, but it wouldn't help him in the end. Catherine was known for having countless amounts of affairs and even produced bastard children from other men. Peter even stated, "God knows where my wife gets her pregnancies. I really don't know if this child is mine and if I ought to recognize it." So Peter had made plans to have Catherine and all her illegitimate children arrested, but Catherine acted first. She had planned a coup with Grigori Orlov, who was apparently one of the fathers of her illegitimate children. Now, as much as history records Catherine as the Great, we will see that she actually planted the seeds of Russia's destruction. Keep in mind that history is written by the victors, and most of what we know about Peter III comes from the people who betrayed and murdered him. So the problem with Catherine was her liberal reforms. It was under Catherine that foreigners and Jews were given equal rights to the native Russians. It was also under Catherine that Freemasonry began to flourish. Ivan Yelagin is known as the father of Russian Freemasonry and was the unofficial secretary of Catherine the Great. So the key points to mention about Catherine's reign. Catherine began pushing Russia towards liberal reforms. Catherine abolished the death penalty and taxes from the nobles, which she used to gain their support. Catherine encouraged the expansion of Russian Freemasonry. Poland would collapse and would be divided between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Because Poland was the Jewish capital of the world, Catherine inherited a lot of Jews, which caused problems for the Orthodox Christians, causing Catherine to create something called the Pale of Settlement. Now, pay attention. Communists and liberals who defend the Jewish Bolshevik Revolution will often say, "Didn't you know that the Jews were oppressed and that they were stuck in the Russian ghettos in the evil Pale of Settlement? They were trapped like prisoners and had no choice but to attack the Russians and overthrow the Tsar." They talk about the Pale of Settlement as if it was a bad thing, even though the Pale of Settlement was in fact a huge percentage of the Russian Empire, and Jews were free to settle anywhere within its borders. It's not like the Jews were sent to Siberia or forced to work in the gulags, so the Jews were just restricted from setting up settlements near the capitals. However, Jews who obtained trades and had professions were welcome to the capital if they were invited. So don't be fooled by this Pale of Settlement argument. Now, as Catherine was pushing for liberal reform and allowing Freemasonry to rise in her empire, we have the great liberal Masonic French Revolution. So understand that Catherine, the great adulteress of Russia, who overthrew her husband and had him murdered, would be the mother of occult Freemasonry and liberalism. She was able to keep her nobles happy by abolishing their taxes, which shifted all the tax burden to the citizens of Russia. And just like today, she removed the death penalty so that corrupt nobles and politicians couldn't be killed for their corruption and treason against the people. Now, when Catherine died in 1796, her son Paul seized the throne. Catherine wanted to leave the throne to her grandson Alexander, who she had raised since he was born. But Paul, who was raised by Elizabeth, apparently burnt the will and seized power. Emperor Paul would go down in history as one of Russia's worst emperors, but let's consider something. Paul began to remove Freemasonry out of Russia. Paul had joined the Catholic Order of the Knights of Malta. Though he was an Orthodox Christian, he joined forces with the Catholics in order to help them fight the new enemy of Christianity, Freemasonry, which grew out of the Protestant movement. Paul began undoing all of Catherine's liberal reforms. Paul ended the nobles' tax exemption and brought in laws that allowed the nobles to be charged with capital punishment. Paul banned Freemasonry. So it's amazing that just like Hitler, the Tsar who tried to ban Jewish Freemasonry from Russia would go down in history as one of Russia's worst emperors, while Catherine, the great adulteress and great liberal reformer who supported Freemasonry, would go down in history as the Great. Now, as the liberal Freemason revolution would rise up in France and murder their Christian monarchs, the Jacobin revolutionaries would begin to slaughter Christians, priests, and nuns. Catherine began to distrust the Masons towards the end of her reign after seeing what they had done in France, with the rise of liberalism. Paul would join the war against the Freemasons and help defend Christianity. Something to consider about Freemasonry. Freemasonry as we know it rose out of the Christian Protestant countries and became the enemy of the Catholic Church. Now, there are arguments that the Protestant movement was orchestrated by the Jews, as there is a counter-argument that says the Protestant movement was a result of Jews infiltrating the Catholic Church. What matters here is the division in European Christianity revolves around the Jews, and these two Christian factions would be used as religious tools to cause Europeans to murder each other until this very day. This is why Hitler said this: "We are a people of different religions, but we are one." Which faith conquers the other is not the question. Rather, the question is whether Christianity stands or falls. We tolerate no one in our ranks who attacks the ideas of Christianity. In fact, our movement is Christian. We are filled with a desire for Catholics and Protestants to discover one another in the deep distress of our own people. Understand that Freemasonry is founded on Jewish mysticism and Babylonian Egyptian paganism, and it's a way for the Jews to recruit non-Jews who are thirsty for wealth and power to do the Jews' dirty work. The rituals involved in Freemasonry are based on rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. You'll notice that the giant pillars used in Masonic lodges are called Jachin and Boaz. These were the two names of the pillars used in the temple at Jerusalem. You'll notice that Freemasonry says that one pillar represents the sun, while the other represents the moon. You'll notice that there are three smaller pillars next to a table. And when we go to the Kaaba, which is the holy temple of Islam, you'll find the same three pillars next to a table, as well as the sun and the moon imagery. So while all these groups may not always appear to be united, they are united in two things. First being the destruction of Christianity. Islam destroyed Christian rule in North Africa, Asia Minor, and the rest of the Middle East, and made several attempts to conquer Christian Europe, as communism made the exact same attempt to eradicate Christianity from Europe. The second point that unites these groups is the Talmudic Pharisaic influence. While there is a lot of Islamic literature that speaks against the Jews, like Muhammad's dying words where he cursed the Christians and the Jews, but what can't be denied is that the entire Islamic religion is grounded in Talmudic Pharisaic Judaism. When you discover that Islam grew out of the ashes of a Jewish Arabian kingdom called the Himyarite Kingdom, you'll understand why Islam is so similar to Judaism. From the fasting to the public praying, multiple wives, the wearing of skull caps, praying facing the direction of their holy shrines, pedophilia, animal sacrifice, and how the stories in the Quran aren't really based on the Bible as much as they're based on the Talmud and Jewish mysticism. The most important thing that unites Muslims and Jews is their hatred for the Apostle Paul and the rejection of the divinity of Christ. Likewise with communism, the manifesto was written by the grandson of famous Talmudic rabbis, Karl Marx, who apparently comes from the same family tree as the Rothschild banking dynasty, that would eventually fund the destruction of Russia. So all these groups can be linked to the enemies of Christianity, the Jewish Pharisees. The Bible says, "The thing that has been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun." We can say what we like about the Catholic and Orthodox churches, but understand that it was these two establishments that kept the Jews and Muslims out of Europe, and the Jews worked really hard to infiltrate them. So, coming back to our story, so when the French Revolution broke out, Paul would send Alexander Suvorov, who was one of the world's greatest generals of all times, to go and battle the French. Suvorov had never lost a battle in his entire military career. Apparently, Paul was not kind to Suvorov, but still, General Suvorov is one of the world's greatest military commanders who ever lived. Suvorov would die in 1800, and in 1801, Paul I, Emperor of Russia, would be assassinated by a group of nobles and ex-military generals. They stormed into his palace and demanded that he sign a declaration of abdication. When Paul refused, he fought for his life, 12 against 1. He was badly beaten and then strangled with his own scarf. The people were told that he died of an epileptic seizure, while his son Alexander, who was raised by Catherine, would issue a declaration within hours of his father's assassination, where he promised to rule the country in the spirit of his grandmother and bring back all her liberal reforms. Freemasonry flourished under Tsar Alexander. As Alexander became Tsar, the Napoleonic Wars would begin to peak. Coalition after coalition would be launched against the French and Napoleon, mainly funded by the Rothschilds in England. Now, this is where it becomes confusing. Freemasonry can be looked at as the non-Jewish arm of Judaism. Now, why would the Jews in England be funding all these coalitions against Napoleon if he's a Freemason? Well, let's understand something. As long as Christian Europeans are murdering other Europeans and the Jews are in the background financing everything, the Jews are winning and the Christians are losing. So let's break down some interesting points about Napoleon and the French Revolution. So first, it's important to note that Napoleon did not start the revolution, he inherited it. He He was just a soldier who advanced himself through military achievements. So the French Revolution started in 1789 by a group calling themselves the Jacobins during the reign of Catherine. This can be looked at as the first great revolution of liberalism, where the reformers were shouting the words liberty, equality, and fraternity, or communism. The French Revolution's main goal was to de-Christianize France, just like Bolshevism did to Russia. The Christian monarchs of France were executed in 1793. Tens of thousands of priests, nuns, and Christians were executed and exiled. Robespierre, who was a lawyer and one of the leaders of the Jacobins, would unleash the Reign of Terror, where almost 17,000 people were guillotined and up to 40,000 prisoners were killed without a trial. The revolutionaries formed rival parties and began to turn on each other. Robespierre was executed and the Jacobins were dissolved. Napoleon would rise to power through his military achievements. Napoleon had proven himself to be an outstanding battle commander specializing in artillery. Napoleon would conquer the Vatican in 1798 when General Berthier would march on Rome. It's important to note that even though the Catholic Church had lost most of its power across Europe, Napoleon did recognize the Catholic Church as the Church of France and restored some of their civil liberties. It was the liberal Jacobin revolutionaries waving the red communist flag that were killing Christians, not Napoleon. After the Catholic Church had lost most of its power because of the Masonic Revolution, there was no one left to keep the Jews at bay. Napoleon and the secular Europeans granted the Jews equal rights to the Christians. Because Christianity is a movement that was born through Jewish corruption and the Jews massacring Christians, the Christians understood the nature of the Jews. And since the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the Jews were restricted in lending money with high interest. Jews and Muslims were forced to wear hats, special clothing, and even yellow stars to warn Christians that they were Jews and Muslims. Jews and Muslims were forbidden from holding any positions in the church and in the government. And they even had laws monitoring converted Jews to make sure they weren't still secretly practicing Judaism. With the secularization of Europe and the fall of Christianity, there was no one left to guard the sheepfold. The sheep were without a shepherd, and the wolves were now free to do as they pleased. All the laws and precautions that the Christian Europeans made to prevent the rise of Islam and Judaism in Europe were destroyed after the Napoleonic Wars. So understand that the rise of Islam and the Jewish dominance in the Western world is a direct result of the fall of Christianity and the rise of liberalism. Our European ancestors spent buckets of blood trying to prevent these people from coming into our countries. But thanks to the liberal anti-Christian reformers, we now find ourselves as slaves to the Jewish bankers as Islam is beginning to conquer our countries that our ancestors gave their lives to defend. Today, the three main nationalist countries that are defending their countries against the mental illness that is called liberalism is Christian Poland, Christian Hungary, and Christian Russia. All these countries recognize the importance of uniting Europe under a Christian flag. So coming back to our story, Tsar Alexander would not only allow Freemasonry to flourish in Russia, but he would also give the Jews equal rights to the Christians according to the Russian laws concerning the Jews of 1804. Jews were given equal rights to the Christians in many ways. They were also given lands, farming equipment, 10-year tax exemption, and the right to attend Russian schools that they would eventually take over. However, because of the famines caused by the Jewish alcohol monopolies and the revolts that followed them, it was illegal for Jews to lend alcohol with interest. Jews were also prohibited from owning taverns and inns in certain parts of Russia. And Jews who broke the alcohol laws would be fined and possibly sent to Siberia. So there seems to have been an internal war between the Masons, Jews, and Napoleon. While Napoleon was part of Jewish Freemasonry, the Rothschilds would fund the destruction of Napoleon. The Russian-French relationship was also very complicated. They switched between enemies to neutral to allies and then back to enemies. You will notice that Napoleon and Hitler would meet a similar fate. While Jews in England were funding their enemies, they both would advance on Moscow. The Russians would use their famous scorched earth tactic, burning their cities and food supplies to prevent their enemies from using them against them. Both Napoleon and Hitler never recovered from their Russian campaigns. After Napoleon lost a huge percentage of his army, Tsar Alexander would march through Europe, removing all the pro-Napoleon governments. Alexander would be proclaimed the hero of Europe, and to this day the square in Berlin is still named after him. The Russians would march on Paris and end Napoleon's rule. Napoleon would be imprisoned on the island of Elba, only to eventually escape and raise up another army where he would be defeated one last time at the famous Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon would then be sent to the island of St. Helena, far away from Europe, where he was most certainly poisoned. As for Tsar Alexander, he would continue to reign for another 10 years following the Napoleonic Wars. He would grow increasingly paranoid of his liberal nobles, and would die suddenly at the age of 47. Alexander had made a secret will that was only known to 4 people, that his younger brother Constantine would not inherit the throne, but the throne would be passed down to the next brother, Nicholas. For the first time in Romanov history, we didn't have Romanovs fighting for the throne, but fighting over who wouldn't have the throne. Neither brother wanted to be Tsar. Now, Constantine was married to a Polish woman not of noble birth, and so this caused a problem for him. Now what's interesting is Nicholas was very anti-liberal and posed a big threat to the secret societies pushing liberalism. So the secret societies and liberal reformers in Russia would take advantage of this confusion in a revolt that would be remembered as the Decembrist Revolution. So on December 1st, 1825, Nicholas I would be proclaimed Emperor of Russia, and on December 14th, when the military regiments were supposed to swear loyalty to the newly crowned Tsar, a revolt would take place in the Senate Square, the heart of St. Petersburg. So the Decembrists began forming their secret societies in 1816, based on Freemasonic teachings, when Russia was at its high point of political influence and military power. They were united under the name the Union of Salvation. So the question is, why would Russian nobles conspire to destroy Russia when it was at its height of power? The main leaders of this revolt were Pavel Pastel, who was the leader of the Southern Society, Nikita Muravyov, who was the leader of the Northern Society. Both men were part of the Masonic order, the Union of Salvation, which was really made up of nobles and military generals who wanted to destroy the Russian government and disband the Russian army to bring in liberal reforms. Russian poet and publisher Kondraty Ryelyev was also among the Decembrist leadership. You can tell that the Decembrists didn't really have a plan, nor did they agree on what they wanted. Nikita Muravyov, the leader of the Northern Society, wanted a constitutional monarchy instead of having a full monarchy, while Pavel Pastel, the leader of the Southern Society, wanted to do away with the Russian royal family like the Jacobins had done in France. The Moscow Guard Regiment had refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas I. There seems to have been some confusion. Some of the men believed that they were fighting for Constantine, who they believed to be the rightful heir to the throne, and that Nicholas had tried to seize it illegally, while the others believed they were fighting for a constitution and liberal reforms. You can see that the Decembrists didn't really have a solid plan. The factions were divided as things became more chaotic. The Decembrist revolt was an extremely unorganized event. When trying to break down the madness in these Russian nobles and these liberal rebels, the only conclusion that can really be drawn is their idea was to first dethrone the Tsar, plunge Russia into chaos, and from that chaos establish order, which is what Freemasonry is all about. Order out of chaos. Dissolve and coagulate. Now, Count Michael Miloradovich, who was a very well-respected general who understood the truth of the matter, went out to try to explain to the soldiers that there was a legal will signed by Tsar Alexander, and that Nicholas did not try to steal the throne at all. In fact, Constantine even signed a letter of abdication, removing his claim to the throne. So as General Miloradovich approached the Russian soldiers, he began to explain the truth to the crowd. Before he could calm the mob down, he was shot and killed by Peter Kahovsky. The Decembrists were hoping for a total revolution by organizing the people into a violent mob based on lies and propaganda. It was also reported that the Decembrists were handing out vodka and paying people with money to join the mob, hoping to fill the streets with violence and chaos, a lot like today where we see paid protesters prostituting themselves for temporary material gain. Pastel not only wanted to execute the royal family, but Pastel had also promised the Jews their own country once the Tsar was killed. Fortunately, Tsar Nicholas was stalling the rebels, while soldiers loyal to Russia were gathering to his side. Nicholas had ordered cannons to be fired at the mob, and fired a warning shot over their heads, hoping that they would disband. Almost 1,300 people were killed, including 1 general, 18 officers, 282 soldiers, and 1,170 civilians, including women and children. But the Masonic Revolution was stopped. The ringleaders were executed, as well as Peter Kachowski, who shot General Miloradovich. After the ringleaders of the revolt were executed, Tsar Nicholas showed mercy to the widows of the men who were executed. He ordered that their wives receive money for the next 20 years, as he ensured that their children would have their education paid for by the Russian state. He also organized a committee to study the grievances and reformed many laws that gave the serfs and peasants more freedoms. Nicholas, being an engineer, began the construction of a railroad going from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which at the time was the world's largest railroad. It stretched 650 kilometers. The Decembrist revolt would be the first big attempt by the Jews and Freemasons to overthrow the Romanovs. While it's hard to point the blame at exactly who was behind the Decembrist revolt, all the wars and the events of terror that will follow will point the finger at England and the Rothschild banking dynasty. It's interesting that there is a memorial to the Decembrists in St. Petersburg that was unveiled during the Soviet Union in 1975 for the 150th anniversary of the Decembrist revolt. It was placed where the men were hanged. You have to ask yourself, why would the Soviet Union, which was apparently anti-Masonic, unveil a monument commemorating this revolt? Why would the Soviet Union erect a monument that is typically used by Freemasons, the obelisk? You'll notice that the Masons love erecting obelisks everywhere they go. An obelisk also represents the enemy of Jesus and the God of the Old Testament. The word obelisk literally means shaft of Baal. Baal was the god of thunder and fertility during the time of the Old Testament. He was the god who the Israelites were told not to worship, but they did anyways. The word Baal is also Hebrew for the word master or lord, but it usually denotes the wrong lord. So Freemasons and mystic Jews openly brag about serving the God that the Bible says not to worship. You'll notice that Masons love using the shaft of Baal for their tombstones. Go to your local cemetery, and I'm sure you'll find Freemasons buried there, either with a square and compass on their grave, or they'll be buried under an obelisk. And you'll notice that the Masons and Jewish mystics love putting their imagery right in front of our faces. For instance, the Washington Monument represents the worship of Baal, standing at exactly 6,660 inches tall. And at the bottom of the shaft of Baal, you'll find an oval shape representing the female genitalia. You will see that Jewish mystics, Freemasons, and pagans are obsessed with sex and fertility. One of the earliest symbols of Baal worship can be found in ancient Carthage, which was a Phoenician Israelite city where they used the moon to represent the woman and the sun to represent the man. This is where the Muslims get their symbol. It's the moon giving birth to the sun. And it's why the Kaaba in Mecca and Masonic lodges are built very similarly. They're based on Jewish mysticism. The Muslims actually worship a black stone shaped like the female genitalia. And so this is the worship of Baal, the thunder god and the god of fertility. Since Hitler and the Christians lost World War II, the Vatican has been completely overrun with Baal worshippers and Freemasons. Now it will make sense to Catholics why they can find pictures of Pope John Paul II kissing the Islamic Quran and blessing a religion that seeks to destroy Christianity. Again, Hitler and the Catholics tried to remove Freemasonry from Europe, and after they lost the war, the Vatican was forced to allow Freemasons to join the church. And this is when you have the rise of pedophilia in the Catholic Church that the Jewish media loves reporting on. The art of war teaches us that the greatest general doesn't send an army to conquer his enemy, but walks into a country and takes it without the people knowing that they've been conquered. Liberalism is a cancer that grows from within our nations, and it spreads through revolution, chaos, and rebellion, and is the enemy of the God of the Bible. So it's important to understand what the word liberal or liberty actually means. Today, we equate the word liberty with the word freedom. But these two words didn't always mean the same thing. The word liberty implies that you are a slave, and it originally meant prescribed freedom, or freedom granted to you by the state. It implies that you have a master. Sailors to this day must be granted liberty before they can leave their ships. Someone must give the sailor permission before he can leave. He is not free to leave the ship as he pleases. In the English law, it is clear that the word liberty implies that you are a slave, where it says, by liberty is meant a privilege held by grant or prescription, by which some men enjoy greater benefits than ordinary subjects. Now, in the French language, the word freedom has been completely removed. Ask any French speaker how to say freedom in French, and they will reply with the word liberty, or in French, liberté. If you were to ask them if there is another word for freedom in French, 99% of the French speakers will not be able to give you an answer, even though the answer is right in front of our faces. The Freemasons use the uneducated public to shout the words liberty to destroy Christian France. And most French speakers today are oblivious to how to say freedom in their own language. You would only have to look at the word Freemason to get your answer. Franc-maçon, Freemason. The word French itself is the very word for freedom. The French came from a Germanic tribe called the Franks, les Francs, which literally means the free. So understand that the very word liberal is rooted in slavery. In part 4, we will continue by following the Romanov dynasty to the Bolshevik Revolution. We will examine how the liberal Freemasons and Jews will resort to terrorism, wars, and assassinations to destabilize Christian Russia, as they push towards the next big Jewish revolution known as the Revolt of 1905, or Bloody Sunday. Thank you all for showing an interest in the subject, and know that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.